The school bus driver pulled off his shirt and handed it back down the aisle, and the teachers tore it into strips. They soaked the pieces in a water jug, and 22 children pressed the wet cloth to their faces and kept breathing. Outside the windows it was black at 9:30 in the morning. Kevin McKay had taken the bus driving job to pay his way through a teaching degree. On the 8th of November 2018, he drove out of a burning town for 5 hours with somebody else's children behind him, through smoke so thick the road kept disappearing, past cars on fire in the oncoming lane. Every child on that bus lived. This is the story of what put them there. And it does not begin that morning. It begins with a piece of iron hung on a steel tower in a river canyon 97 years earlier. In 1921, crews working for the Great Western Power Company strung a high-voltage transmission line through the Feather River Canyon in the dry mountains of Northern California. The wire hung from the towers on C-shaped iron hooks, each one about the size of a hand. In 1930, Pacific Gas and Electric bought the line, hooks and all. A county grand jury would later describe that purchase in one brutal sentence. In essence, PG&E blindly bought a used car and drove it until it fell apart. For 88 years, on a tower the company's own records listed as Tower 27222, one of those original hooks swung in the canyon wind, and every gust wore the iron a little thinner. Nobody replaced it. Almost nobody looked at it. It hung there through the Depression, through the war, through the whole life of the town growing on the ridge a few miles south. A town of 26,000 people, mostly retirees, called Paradise. A few minutes past 6 in the morning, on the 8th of November, 2018, the old hook finished wearing out. It snapped. The high-voltage wire it had held for nearly a century dropped against the steel of the tower, and the short circuit sprayed molten metal into the brush below. It had not rained in any real way for 7 months. The gusts pouring through the canyon that morning were running near 50 miles an hour. A PG&E employee looking up the canyon saw fire under the line by about 6:30. By then, the fire was already too big to stop, and it was moving toward the ridge. At its peak, it consumed an acre every second. A football field of ground, gone every time your heart beats. Here is what the company knew, written in its own files. In 2007, one of its own engineers asked for $800,000 to replace part of this exact line, warning of multiple failures from aging equipment. The probability of failure, he wrote, is imminent. The company gave the plan a quarter of the money, then canceled it altogether 2 years later. In December of 2012, a winter storm knocked one of the line's towers to the ground, and it dragged 4 more down with it. Towers nearly a century old, folding into a canyon. An engineer recommended inspecting the rest of them. That inspection never happened. The grand jury that later dug through those files found a pattern they called run to failure. Keep the old iron in service until it breaks, and spend the maintenance money somewhere else. The report used the words callous disregard. 11 years of paper warned about that line. The warnings were filed away, and the iron stayed up, and the town below it kept not knowing. At 6 minutes to 8, Paradise was ordered to evacuate. 26,000 people, 1 ridge, 4 roads down. Within minutes, embers riding the gusts were landing inside the town itself, and houses began to burn blocks ahead of the fire itself. The 4 roads jammed solid. People sat in gridlock watching flames walk up to the shoulder, then left their cars in the road and ran. Mothers called their children to say goodbye. The sky went from morning to midnight in under an hour, and the streetlights came back on, and under them a whole town crawled downhill through falling fire. That was the traffic Kevin McKay steered his bus into, 22 children breathing through the wet rags of his shirt, 5 hours to cover 30 miles. On the east side of town, Feather River Hospital emptied itself in about 20 minutes. Nurses pulled tubes, lifted patients into wheelchairs, and loaded them into whatever was in the parking lot. Staff cars, pickup trucks, their own back seats. A surgical nurse named Nicole Jolly got her patients out and then found the road ahead of her burning. Her car was struck from behind and shoved toward a ravine, flames on both sides, trees coming down. She called her husband. He told her, "Run." She got out and ran through the fire, and when her pants caught, 2 firefighters beat the flames out, wrapped her in a fire blanket, and lifted her into a truck. A bulldozer shoved the abandoned cars off the road to open a path. Jolly went back to the patients and stayed until the last of them were out. But this fire found the people who could not run. Paradise was a retirement town, and the fire came faster than old bodies move. T.K. Huff was 71, a farm laborer his whole life, one-legged since a harvest accident. He met the fire in his wheelchair, holding a garden hose. When they found him, the wheelchair was 10 feet away. The marks on the ground showed he had dragged himself, hand over hand, trying to get out. Ernie Foss was 63, a musician who had left the Bay Area because Paradise was what he could afford. He made it as far as his front yard, next to the oxygen tank he needed to breathe, with his dog beside him. Rose Farrell was 99 years old. She was found on her own front porch, her wheelchair close by. 85 people died on that ridge. Most of them were elderly. Many were disabled. The fire took the town in a morning, and it took it from the people least able to leave. By evening, 95% of Paradise was gone. Nearly 19,000 buildings burned. Homes, schools, the hospital the nurses had emptied. It was the deadliest wildfire in California history, and the deadliest anywhere in America in 100 years. And when the state's fire investigators walked the cold canyon and climbed Tower 27-222, they brought the cause down in an evidence bag. One C-shaped iron hook, hung in 1921, worn almost through. A century of neglect and a morning of fire had finally met, connected by a piece of metal you could hold in your hand. Here is the part that is hard to believe. When the hook snapped, Pacific Gas and Electric was already a convicted felon. In 2010, one of its neglected gas pipelines had blown apart a neighborhood south of San Francisco and killed 8 people. And in 2016, a federal jury convicted the company of 6 felonies for it. The campfire happened while the company was still serving its probation for the last disaster. The federal judge supervising that probation, William Alsop, would tally the 5 probation years in his final report. The company's equipment had started more than 30 wildfires, burned nearly 1.5 million acres, and killed over 100 Californians. His written verdict, PG&E has gone on a crime spree and will emerge from probation as a continuing menace to California. Pacific Gas and Electric went into bankruptcy within 3 months of the campfire, buried under the cost of what the hook had started. And in June of 2020, in a courtroom in Northern California, the company answered for the people of Paradise and pleaded guilty. 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 1 for every death the prosecutors could prove. The judge spoke every name aloud, one at a time, while each victim's photograph looked down from a screen, and for every name, the company's chief executive stood and answered, "Guilty, Your Honor," 84 times. Then came the sentence, the maximum the law allows for a corporation that has killed 84 people. a fine of $3.5 million, roughly $40,000 a life. No one went to prison because the defendant was a company, and you cannot jail a company. The victims were promised $13.5 billion, but half of it arrived as shares of the company's own stock. And years later, survivors who had lost everything were still being paid 70 cents on every dollar they were owed. Paradise is rebuilding, slowly. By 2025, about 11,000 people had come back to the ridge, less than half the town the fire took. Kevin McKay finished his degree. The bus driver became a teacher. The line that started it all is gone. After the fire, the company finally took the Caribou Palermo down for good, 88 years after buying it used. And the hook survives, photographed from every angle, its worn groove polished smooth by a century of wind. It hangs in the case file now the way it hung in the canyon, quietly, while everyone looks somewhere else. In the summer of 2026, smoke from distant wildfires dimmed the sun over 100 million Americans, and cities a continent away from any flame breathed like paradise at noon. The fire needed 90 minutes to reach the town. The warning sat in a file for 11 years. The hook held on for 97. And in all that time, nobody came to look. In paradise, they keep what is left of it locked in an evidence room. But the post-mortem writes itself. The only question is whether anyone reads it before the next one.